So good morning, everybody. We got the prayer card, so I'll hold it for those who don't have it, and we'll say it together. Glory be to the Almighty power and love, created me in His image and likeness. Glory be to the Son, who in His incarnation became man, that I could become God. Glory be to the Holy Spirit, who rises in the Son, and be a partaker of His divine. Glory be to the undivided Trinity, now and forever. Amen. So Billy, when they put me through that canonization tube, you can, if I come out the other end, you can say, this is the prayer that Father Phil composed.
You got it, Father.
Okay, thank you. You have to have you have to have somebody who promotes your cause. So we'll hand that over to Billy. And we have to, we also have to remember our patron saint of the Wednesday gathering, Beverly Reed. So we ask her to intercede for us. She was such a regular here and we miss her. Her daughter Celia is usually with us, but she's traveling today. So hopefully she'll have a chance to listen to the recording. So it's nice to see. Let's see, what do we have? We have 16 on Zoom. That's nice. Jesse, I saw this little blurb last week that I meant to read a little bit at the gathering and I forgot to do it. So I'll start with it today because it'll be maybe a good catalyst for some ideas I'm hoping to share with you today. So this is called the Irish philosophy. There are only two things to worry about. Either you are well or you are sick. If you're well, then there's nothing more to worry about. If you're sick, then there are still two things to worry about. Either you'll get well or you'll die. If you get well, there's nothing to worry about. If you die, there are still two things to worry about. Either you'll go to heaven or you'll go to hell. If you go to heaven, you'll have nothing to worry about. And if you go to hell, you'll be so damn busy shaking hands with all your friends, you won't have time to worry. So you all know I'm a Christian universalist, but that's a funny twist on the tail. Okay. What I want to, I'm reading a great book right now. In fact, I'll hold it up for you. You can see that it's not a short book called Pauline Dogmatics by an author that I respect a lot. I think he gets Paul right. And so it's an inspiring commentary for me. And one of the things, I forgot to put everybody on. Let me put you on mute for a second.
Hey, I'll see you later.
Okay. If you want to chat, just unmute yourself. So one of the things he writes in there is he's speaking about how we want to tell the story of the Christian faith. Very often the story of the Christian faith or the explanation of the faith is told in terms of sin and redemption. So there was a sin committed and the world is fallen. And so as a response to the problem, God sends the solution. And then we have the various atonement theories and all the other theology that comes out of that. So you have one way of telling the story is to frame it in terms of a problem to which God offers the solution. But he says that's really not the best way to tell the Christian story. He says, at least it's not Paul's way to tell the Christian story. And in a certain sense, that's why Peter and Paul collided a little bit. Paul was telling the story of Jesus from a different perspective and from a different direction than Peter and the other apostles. And in today's reading from the Acts of the Apostles, you can see that there was a controversy brewing in the early church, really right around 15 AD, where the big debate was, do people have to become Jews? Do they have to become circumcised before they can become Christian? Do you have to kind of go through a two-stage process of becoming a Christian? And some of the people in Jerusalem, especially the people who had been converts from the Pharisees, were saying, yes, it's the fulfillment of the law, but it's never the neglect of the law. So, but Paul said, no, if you think that way, then you're still thinking according to the flesh. You're not thinking according to the Spirit. So there was a controversy, and Paul and Peter clashed over that issue and many others in the early church. So there was a collision, and this author and many other authors say the way to understand some of the controversy from the standpoint of different ways of telling the story, different perspectives on who the mystery of Jesus of Nazareth is and was and is today. And Paul had a much different perspective, and that's the perspective that I purvey every week on the gatherings here. Now, for many years, I did not realize that the perspective that I was trying to share, which is not mine at all, it comes from the early church fathers, especially Saint Athanasius and Saint Irenaeus, and not many others that I could mention. So the perspective of the early church fathers, I only came to learn much later after that perspective totally entranced me and converted me completely to my way of telling the story. Only later did I learn, and I think only recently have scholars actually discovered that was Paul's perspective itself, and that the early church fathers really were amplifying the seeds of a vision of God, seeds of a vision of what was happening in and through Christ, that Paul had. I'd love to talk sometime, and I will talk sometime, about how that's a relatively recent discovery for the majority of scholars who do intensive research, because the understanding of Paul has been for ever since the Middle Ages, ever since the Reformation. Paul has always been claimed as the patron saint of the Protestants. Luther said, Paul is giving us a new gospel here. He's saying you are justified not by works, which is what the Catholic Church teaches. You're not justified by works, but you're justified by faith. And so those two readings of the gospel got pitted against each other, and both of them got misunderstood in the polemics that went on ever since the time of Luther right till the present time. Though 30 years ago, there was a joint declaration made between the Lutherans and the Catholics saying, we understand that the polemics that have so divided the churches need not have been, because none of us understood Paul properly. Okay, so there is a new understanding of Paul emerging, which ironically in my mind is really a return to the vision of the early church that you've heard me say so much about on these gatherings. So none of that's important right now, except to tell you that so that Paul tells the story, and because Paul understood the story of the mystery of Christ. You see, for Paul, the mystery of Christ was so much larger than the figure of Jesus. Though the mystery of Christ is Jesus, but it's Jesus in the fullness of his identity as the eternal Word of God and as the Alpha and the Omega, the one in whom everything exists and the one through whom everything exists, so that somehow the world is in Christ and Christ is in the world. Even though they are not identical, they form in some mystical way that can only be revealed by the Holy Spirit. They form an indissoluble whole. And so we are in God and God is in us. And this is the mystery that Paul and Father Phil continue to try to communicate to the people of God. You must stop trying to view God as an object over against yourself, or as a distant reality with whom you might someday, one day, if you're really, really good and pray a lot and do all the right things, one day you might have some contact with this person and he might find you acceptable to him. And that is just looking at the mystery of Christ through the wrong end of the telescope. You're looking at it as if it's a distant planet, when in fact, if you turn the telescope around, you'll see that it's an immediate reality. So having that switch of perspective is what my life is helping people make that switch of perspective, what my life is all about, only because that switch of perspective happened for me. So I know what it feels like to be on the other side of that perspective, and I know what it feels like to be on the inside of the Pauline perspective as well. And this author that I'm reading right now, he says, if you listen to the way Paul describes the mystery of Christ, it's after the fashion of somebody writing a memoir. Do you know what a memoir is? Okay. So what's the difference between, I guess a memoir and an autobiography are kind of the same thing. And I have a cousin on this call, Carrie, and she's an English devotee and a student of English literature. And she was an English teacher in high school, so she could probably say this a lot more articulately than I can, though she just left her chair, probably because I'm already bastardizing the topic. But a memoir, and I'm just using this metaphor because I want to, people have said to me in the past, you should write your story sometime. It's so interesting. You went into the priesthood, you went out of the priesthood, you had a conversion outside the priesthood, you came back into the priesthood, you have a son, you're on good terms with your ex-wife, you should just write your story. And I suppose that's true, and I don't think that'll ever happen, but who knows. But it would be, but if one were to write a memoir, and so what I'm going to give you today, I felt very strongly about doing this because anyway, I suppose just because the feeling came to me, I'd like to just give you kind of a little verbal memoir to tell you how my journey kind of led this place. But the point about a memoir is that you're always writing it by looking back. So you're writing it from the standpoint of where you are, which allows you to look back. If you were writing it just as a pure narrative, it would be relatively flat. You see, a memoir looks back and it gives you, because with a memoir, you have kind of a key to, you can understand things, and this goes for all of us, not just for me, but we can understand things now in the light of what we have learned better than we can if we just started at the beginning and tried to figure it out as we go along. We've been doing that our whole lives. And I suppose if we approach life as something that has to be figured out, you'll never do that. It's when you have kind of what Jesus might say, when you've discovered the pearl of great price, which means I have discovered and I'm able to put into words for myself, or I'm able to have a felt sense for myself of what I have learned by living my life. I always tell people, until you can write out what your life has been all about, or what you are all about, what the marketing class calls a personal mission statement. The shuckers and jivers who do seminars on this kind of stuff. I know what my personal mission statement is. It's to promote a Trinitarian vision of deification and contemplative prayer. Now, I can say that. It's one sentence. There, nothing I do, nothing I think, nothing I'm interested in, or maybe I put it more positively, everything I do, everything I think, and anything that I'm interested in always revolves around that statement that I just made. Now, everybody's life revolves around a central point, kind of like the center and of a protractor. You put down a little needle and so everybody's life, when we were conceived in the womb by God, we were identified as a unique person whose identity is also linked to that which they in particular are supposed to learn in life. Okay, not just that they're supposed to learn it, they're supposed to be all about it. I mean, all of us have loves, right? All of us have passions. All of us like certain things and don't like other certain things. But very few of us have enough self-understanding, or maybe I should even say it better from my own perspective. Very few of us, I shouldn't make any judgments about anybody else. Let me say this. In my life, and this will maybe be the beginning of the memoir, in my life, until I understood through revelation, by that I mean a gradual disclosure to me by God through the bumps and bruises of my life, until I understood what I'm all about. I see, all of us have these loves and dislikes, and those are all clues. Those are all signposts to the pearl of great price that is in the center of our soul, which is what we were created to do. So the things we love and the things we hate are all indicators of something more primordial within us, something more original in us. It's a passion. It's a mission. Each of us has a personal mission. That is to say, we were created to discover and to identify and then to use as the measure of all of our activities and all of our time and the use of all of our resources. We are meant to discover something about ourselves that is kind of the North Star of our lives. It's the innermost center of our being, which defines us as the person God created us to do. So I was created to do what I'm doing today. Now, each person listening to this is created to do something different. And my doing what I do is meant to enhance you doing what you do. And of course, what I do is make people aware that there is this image of God in them and there is this personal identity within them. And until I'm real clear with myself about what that personal identity is, my life will be helter-skelter. It'll be like a set of wind chimes that whatever comes along, I'll be blowing in the breeze. And I will know that something's wrong when I get really mad, because when I get really mad, that means that something that's happening in my life is actually pulling me away from what I should really be doing. Except I'm not aware that that's the reason I'm really mad. I'm not aware that there's something even more beautiful beneath me that is being neglected, which is causing my anger to rise. Okay, so I'm not trying to go through all the dynamics of this. What I'm simply trying to tell you is that with a person like Paul and with a person like myself, once it becomes clear to a person, and in my experience, most people live their entire lives in this world without not only not becoming clear, not even having a clue. If you're depressed, you don't have a clue about who you are, because if you knew who you were, you would be filled with constant joy. And even though, so let's say I used to have long conversations with a friend of mine who's a medical doctor and an atheist. And he agreed completely. He said, listen, he said, I discovered as a child that and his father was a physician. And he said, yes, you could say I was imitating my dad. He said, but once I started studying chemistry and biochemistry, he said, I fell in absolute love with it. And he says, for many years, I was a surgeon. And he says, I just loved what I did. He said, now, was it difficult to go to med school? Yes. Did I suffer? Yes. But the suffering was a pure joy, because I knew it was going for the purpose of serving what my true love was. Maybe that's just the simplest way of saying it. Until I discover what my true love is, and it's never another person. If I'm married, I marry another person because they help me understand more deeply and they help me exercise more completely the unique identity that I am. They help me, they respect, and they treasure, and they help promote my own personal mission. And I do the same for them. Of course, you wouldn't say that's exactly every person's notion of marriage, but in fact, I don't know that I've ever met anyone who had that notion of marriage. Actually, my wife and I did kind of. And we still kind of do that. We promote each other's, we thought our missions coincided at the time, and it's clear now that it became clear that they don't. But even to this day, even though we're now apart, I still promote her personal mission. I don't think she probably would be able to say it as succinctly as I state mine. And I'm not drawing attention to myself for any other reason than to be illustrative of what I'm praying and hoping you will find, everyone listening to this will find a way to do. Because until you find that, you're lost in the woods. You don't know, and when I'm lost in the woods, then I still have a notion of God. And it's the God that I hope brings me out of the woods one day. Okay, but that's not the notion of God that you need to have, but it's the notion of God that we default to when we don't know who we are. And in my experience, very, very few people, and I say this because I know for how many years I parceled out my identity to those who told me you should do this and you should do that. So I lived as what we call in addiction treatment, a codependent creature, my self-worth, my sense of who I am rose or fell depending on your mood for the day. If you liked me, I was great. If you looked at me in the wrong direction, I felt like I should go out and kill myself because I'm worthless, or eat myself to death, or drink myself to death. Okay, so I medicate myself when I don't know myself, and sometimes getting myself in so much trouble. I used to say to my mother was depressed for many years in her life, partly because she was still always grieving the death of my sister, I believe. But my mother was so, her identity was so tight, and I love my mother dearly. I've come to see the real woman under the codependent. As she's been gone from me, I've really come to appreciate my mother now, and I appreciated her then too, but I appreciate her way more now but I used to say to her, and I probably still say to her today if she was here in the condition I last saw her, which was depressed. And she was depressed because her own true self had been surrendered so completely to her husband, to her children, to her bosses, to her parents, to her authority figures, that she did not know, she could never give herself permission to indulge herself on anything. But every once in a while, you could see that she would see, because codependents who are there to please everybody because they don't know themselves, they're always smiling. But it's gallows humor that they're in. It's hollow, it's empty, it's without real mirth. It can be cynical, it can be sarcastic, but it's without real mirth because they have sold themselves out, and their self that has been sold out knows that it's been sold out, but it never really goes away. Okay, and it remains like the princess and the pea. Our true self remains under those multi-layered mattresses of pleasing others. And until those are all pulled off, and I'm able to resuscitate that true self within me. So I used to say to my mom, I'd say, Mom, because she never yelled that I can remember, always trying to be very nice, but just trying to do the best she could. And I used to say to her, Mom, the best thing for you that ever could happen was if you would just scream your living daylights out. Let it all out, because you have like years of anger at yourself for selling yourself short. And she would say, go in the other room. No, she wouldn't really say that. Honestly, this woman was as sweet as could be. And there was a beautiful person under there. It grieves me that she never had got the permission or gave herself the permission to really discover, but you could see it. I could see it. She couldn't see it. We could all see it. It was a very beautiful thing. Anything that's good about me, I know that I get from my mother. So don't believe me, I'm not here to trash my mother, anything but the opposite. But I'm saying if you're able to awaken to who you really are, then the opinions of others, they matter. You take them into account, but they never disturb your general direction in life, because you have this North Star that's always guiding you. And that is the image and likeness of God within us. And it's there in everyone. but very, very few people are in touch with it or aware of it, and even fewer are able to define it or describe it. But I say again, until you can. So Paul, on the road to Damascus, had his core identity revealed to him, and he had all the false identities, especially that of a religious Pharisee. He had them pulled up, he had them annihilated all in one intervention from God. And it was that deciding factor. So when that happened, now with me, it happened very gradually. And I want to tell you, so this is going to be a little bit of a memoir. I hope you can, I'm going to take a drink of water here so I can keep going. Say one more thing methodologically, then I'll fill in a few details of my own memoir here for you. And I do this again so that you will be encouraged to envision your own memoir and begin to write it by identifying the golden thread. Sister Peter used to talk to me about the golden thread, which I'll tell you about in a minute. So once Paul had awakened to the truth about God and the truth about himself, and once I awoke first to this different model of God, and then to my role in promoting that different model of God. When a person awakens to the thing that makes everything, when I awaken to that one thing, it makes everything else clear. It removes all the guilt and shame about any previous so-called mistakes, because you realize in retrospect, okay, you realize in retrospect that all those things that I previously called mistakes when I was still, I can only beat myself up. I can only criticize myself when I have not yet discovered myself. This is so important. Once Paul discovered who he was and who Christ was, he was completely relieved of his perfectionism. He was completely relieved of his, Joe lets us know it's 10 a.m. When I come awake, everything that went before it seems like a dream. But when I come awake, I'm able to look back on the path that got me here, no longer with guilt, but with gratitude. It's like coming to the last, so here's what it's like. And I've used these images on this before, and I'm telling you this not just because of my story, but this is the way you need to read the scriptures as well. You can't start at the beginning of the scriptures and work your way up to Jesus and then go through the gospels and come to the resurrection and say, now I've arrived. It doesn't work that way. It's the other way around. In the resurrection, the arrival was revealed. And now everything else before it begins to make sense. You can't get to the resurrection from reading what went before it. You have to interpret what went before it after. In other words, the solution was revealed before the problem was properly understood. Once the solution came, the problem looks in an entirely different light. It wasn't the problem that brought the solution. It's what in fact, what we have as a revelation is not a solution at all. It's just a revelation of why everything went haywire in the first place. Does that make any sense? Okay. So when you read your story backwards, it makes a whole lot more sense than if you were to try to tell it from the starting at the beginning and moving forward. Okay. So I'm gonna state again what I have kind of awakened to and what I believe Paul awakened to, because they're basically the same thing. I told you that a pivotal point in my own story now, and what you see me doing in these Wednesday, what I do in these Wednesday gatherings, what I do everywhere, what I do in the Sunday homilies, what I do in conversations with friends, what I do, you know, there's no, I don't do anything different than I do on the Wednesday gatherings. I'd be happy if my life was just one continuous Wednesday gathering. And that's what it was for Paul. He just went around and had gatherings and did what I'm doing in hopes that what happened to him would happen to you too. So I'm just bearing witness to something that happened to me. Now, it didn't happen like Paul. and I'm not exactly claiming it's identical with Paul's, but there are times it is so, my experience my experience is so coincident with that of Paul. And I went most of my life without, I couldn't stand to read Paul. I couldn't understand him. It made no sense to me. I thought the Protestants had co-opted him for their own purposes. So I had no use for St. Paul at all until I read St. Athanasius. I think I told you I was out of the priesthood. Okay, so I'm going to work my way backwards now. I got to keep an eye on the time. So we got 1 hour left. So I talk so long on these things. Something I always pinpoint my conversion, my road of Damascus event, even though Paul's was sudden and complete. Mine was unexpected and in a certain sense sudden, but it has grown. The fullness of what I understood that night in 1994, 93, it was whatever year the new Catechism of the Catholic Church was first published. Whatever year the Catechism of the Catholic Church was first published was when this occurred to me, because I was out of the priesthood at the time. You see, when I go back and tell you about what happened to me, the chronology is not all that important. It's what happened that's important. The chronology can't tell you anything. Do you remember a long time ago? I want to just use one more metaphor for what I'm trying to do here, because it's kind of hard to grasp unless you really think about it. I think I told you before, I asked you this question as a way of learning how to read the scriptures backwards. Read them backwards from the resurrection rather than forwards from Genesis. When you do that, you'll understand why God allowed everything that happened before. If you understood what he eventually did, everything that he allowed before will begin to make sense for you. Whereas if you try to make sense out of it going along, you'll end up with this schizophrenic God who's both angry and merciful at the same time. And you'll never get to what is actually revealed. Now, Paul is a further revelation. Paul's writings are an amplification on the meaning of the resurrection. So the whole New Testament after the resurrection, Paul's really, in a certain sense, his writings are the fullness of what the Gospels were trying to tell us in chronological form. Okay, so meaning and chronology are not the same thing. It's kind of like any story or any good mystery novel. Once the final solution is revealed, then you say, oh, that's why she did that. When you're going through it, you're like lost in the woods here. But when the final piece is put in place, it's like the light comes on. I compare it to an awakening when the final piece has been put in place. So all our lives have all these puzzle pieces, but the whole picture is not clear until that one seminal piece is put in. You remember I used the image of the arch in St. Louis that's being built, or when we used to go up as a kid to Niagara Bridge, we used to see the bridge go. It would come from the American side and the Canadian side. I said, hey, Dad, what if they don't meet? And he says, they're in a boatload of trouble if they don't meet. So, but the road, you see, and I use this image of the arch and the bridge, and I want to use one other image, which I've used before, but it bears repeating. Until that final piece is put in place, and that final piece is what I'm calling your personal identity. Until that little piece is found and put in there, your future means nothing and your past means nothing. They're both buckets of misery, basically, or at least confusion. They're in darkness. There's no lights, there's no nothing. But when that final piece, it's like connecting two wires that are filled with electricity, but until they're connected, nothing happens. When they're connected, everything is seen in a different light. The other image I always like to use to illustrate the resurrection, and in our context today, your personal mission statement. You know, I said, okay, now tell me what the third number I'm looking for here is in this sequence. 2, ... 4, ... question mark.
6 or 8.
It could be 6, it could be 8, it could be 16, and I'm sure artificial intelligence could give us a few more digits somewhere out there.
7.
No.
No. Turn off the phone.
Do what?
Turn off the phone.
Yeah, it's off, it just doesn't,
No, it's not.
oh, turn it off completely, I got it.
There we go. Okay.
Now you won't get it.
Okay. 3 times the charm. Okay, so my point here is that your life is like that. The events of your life are like a sequence, 2, 4. But until you discover that third, until you discover the magic number unlocks the meaning. The 2 numbers, 2 and 4, have no meaning. Your sacraments in your life, they have relatively no meaning. Your marriage, it has relatively, nothing I do in my life relatively has any meaning until I'm able to put in that defining piece. And in a certain sense, if I haven't done it in this world, you might say the final judgment or the judgment at Christ's seat is he puts in that piece. And what is illumined is, oh, look at how you neglected all these relationships that could have served your personal mission. And look at all the people who did serve your personal mission that you thought were irrelevant in your life. When the final piece is put in, things become clear that you could not have imagined had any meaning at all. And things that you had invested all your time and energy in proved to be as so much rubbish, as Paul said. Okay, so I'm stressing this because, and the thing is, it's possible for everybody to find that missing piece long before they die. And this is what Jesus meant, I believe. If you haven't found that missing piece, you're just in a living death. Nothing is happening. You're like the bridge that hasn't been connected yet. You're like the arch that hasn't been completed. You're just dead in the water. That's why life seems to be blah. That's why everything depresses you. That's why there's always a crisis. When that final piece is put in place, guilt goes away, shame goes away, depression goes away. And now I'm not talking about clinical depression or chemical depression, none of that stuff. But spiritually speaking, everything comes alive, joy floods the heart, and the fear of death dissolves completely. Okay, so given that framework, let me just tell you, look, so my golden thread, the defining piece in my life is to promote a Trinitarian vision of deification and contemplative prayer. Now, where did I learn about so there are 3 pieces to that. I'm a promoter. I'm a promoter of the Trinity. I'm a promoter of something called deification, and I'm a promoter of something called contemplative prayer. Now, I know today that's who I am, beyond a shadow of a doubt, without remainder, that's who I am. What that allows me to do is go back and look at the events in my life and see how beautifully God worked all of these things to reveal that to me. And I say that because I'm saying it's a gift. I could have gone the rest of my life as a drug addict. I could have gone the rest of my life as an ex-priest buried in the sand. And really what I'm telling you has nothing at all to do with the priesthood. I'm a priest because it serves this mission. God called me to be a priest. My vocation in life is not to be a priest. My state of life is that of the priesthood in order to promote my vocation, which is to promote a Trinitarian vision. Priesthood and marriage are states of life for unique individuals within those states of life. Those states of life are perfectly suited for that person because they promote their personal mission, not the other way around. And this is why you see the abuse in the priesthood and the rest of it, and priests being unhappy and becoming alcoholic and weighing 5,000 pounds. The reason they do that is because they think the priesthood is the be all and end all of their lives, and it is not. They are called to the priesthood so that God can use them as an instrument of his glory in a way that only they can do. And even if they weren't in the priesthood, they could still manifest his glory by doing what they are created to do. Now, most priests can't separate their role from their state of life from their true vocation, okay? And I'm not going to belabor that anymore. I'm just going to tell you what happened to me, okay? So, I mean, I could go, maybe one day I'll go all the way back to my childhood. I mean, I have memories there as well. Well, I'll tell you one childhood memory that led up to this. So I'll just revisit the turning point again. In 1993 or 1994, I'm teaching this adult ed class. I'm out of the priesthood. I left the priesthood in 1986, 87, 86, I guess. And then re-entered in 2009. So almost 25 years, 20 years, 23 years. 17 of which were spent trying to find a bishop. So to let me back, yeah. But there was a priest who had kind of taken pity on me. He knew I was an ex-priest. He knew I wanted to come back to the priesthood. Actually, he encouraged it. And he said, hey, in the meantime, how about teaching this class for me? Because he was very instrumental in my life. Though he is a person who has never discovered his personal vocation, but he's about the best priest you could ever meet, because he's very much like my mother. He's totally dedicated to others at the complete neglect of himself. But all the people he has helped have been helped towards their personal vocation because he was such a good priest. So nothing is ever lost in God's economy. Don't get me wrong here. Eventually, our true identity is revealed to us. And in the end, we're all filled with joy. There's a passage in the book of Revelations, chapter 2, verse 17. God, when we see him, gives us a little white stone on the back of which is written our true name, which is the same thing as our personal vocation or our true identity. And when that's made clear to us, everything else in our life, both past and future, is also made clear to us. Okay. I'm just telling you, it's possible to have all that be made clear in this life if you ask God to do it for you. And Paul had no notion that God was going to do it for him. And I had no notion he was ever going to do it for me. I mean, I thought I was on the right path. Everybody kind of feels their way towards their true identity. I mean, we don't do things we absolutely abhor. I mean, there are certain things that everybody will draw the line at, but drawing a line at something that I won't do is not yet discovering what I cannot not do. And so my true vocation are those things that I would rather die than not be able to do blank. And it can't be something like spend time with my grandchildren. It's got to be that which makes me want to spend time with my grandchildren. So it's always deeper than the activities that I'm doing. It's always deeper than the people I'm doing it with. It's something that's a mystery in God and in me, but God will reveal it to me if I'm open. And I have to be willing, and I have to be willing to let go of a lot of things in my life that do not serve my personal interests. It's hard to tell somebody, I'm not going there. I don't like to do that. I don't like to do it. Well, I like to do it. I want you to come with me. Screw you. I'm not doing it. I don't want to do it. I don't like to do it. I'm not going to have anything to do with it. I'm bored to tears. Don't ask me to do that again. Very few people can say that, because most people in some sense are people pleasers. But when I live to please other people, I lose track with who God made me to be. When I discover who God made me to be, then I can be with others anywhere and be happy, but also have the proper distance and boundaries and space needed to have a healthy, intimate relationship without always agreeing with them. Okay. So, God, this is good. Okay, there we go. Okay, so now back to my story. Okay, so I'm teaching this class, and this student, I've told you this before, I tell it at almost every place I give a talk or give a retreat, but this student raises his hand, a guy, Roger Ensign is his name. Remember him very well, very devout Catholic. And I had never, I was like like any good teacher, I was one chapter ahead of the students. I figured the new catechism of the Catholic Church, what am I going to read that I don't already know? I'm an expert in Catholic theology. Look at my library. It's got 5,000 volumes. Well, he raises his hand and he says, what's this? He says, what is this line? He said, God became man so man could become God. He said, man can't become God. That's heresy. I said, is the catechism quoting the Mormons? What is this? So I look and it says Saint Athanasius. Well, I was educated well enough at that point to know that Saint Athanasius was a doctor of the church, that he was the Bishop of Alexandria, that he was probably the most brilliant theologian in the early church. He was the one who was responsible for the Nicene Creed, God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made, one in being with the Father, through whom all things were made. That was Saint Athanasius. And I said, Athanasius wrote that? I said, he can't have written that. It must be a misprint. It's the first edition of the catechism. I'll bet they just didn't have a good enough editor. So I went upstairs and pulled out some books on the early church father and found the reference, which I have footnoted on our prayer that we read each week. It's his book called On the Incarnation, or in Greek, On the Inhumanization of God. Isn't that a nice title? Instead of the incarnation, he called it On the Inhumanization of God. In any event, sure enough, Athanasius said God became man so man could become God. And then in my book that I was reading that in doing my research, it said, see Saint Irenaeus, who lived 200 years before Athanasius. Now, Irenaeus was a disciple of Saint Polycarp, who was a direct disciple of Saint John, the evangelist. And Irenaeus wrote, he became what we are. Year immersed in the early thought, and I began to see that they all had the exact same vision. The one I like maybe even more than Athanasius is Saint Maximus the Confessor. He lived in the 6th century. He said, in the same measure that God became man, we become divine. In the same measure that God became man, which was completely, we become divine. God was a human person who acquired a human nature. We are human persons who acquire a divine nature. And that exchange of natures is so complete that it's impossible for the angels to make any distinguishment between those who are in Christ and Christ himself. They're members of the same body. They're cells of the same mystery. They and Christ are one as far as the angelic beings go. So when that vision of being in Christ and being a partaker of the divine nature, even while I remain a human person, and opening my heart and mind to what the implications of that could be, there was such a light that over time flooded my mind and my soul that literally everything was reconfigured. Now, I had a lot of spiritual and theological apparatus to work with, but it was like a computer genius coming in and rearranging the internal programming so that everything read in a different direction now. And that's when my awareness of what St. Paul was saying came to me as well. Together with this new perspective on St. Paul. So that was the turning point for me. And so now I know that doing what I do on the Wednesday gathering is the be all and end all of my existence. And now that allows me to look back on things that happened and see how that kind of led up to that or served this mission and guaranteed, made it happen, I guess I should say. Okay. You know, if I go all the way back, I don't know what order to go in here because it really doesn't matter. Once you have the interpretive key, you can go anywhere and understand exactly what was happening in your life. And I can almost understand what's going to happen in the future because of having this interpretive key. But when I think of being one with God, you know, if you had to say that's the thing that drives me right now, my awareness that each of us is one with God, and that I can not only be one with God in being, as St. John of the Cross said. St. John of the Cross said, Two kinds of union are available to the human person. Everybody has the first kind of union with God. I am united with God by virtue of my creation. He is present in me at every moment as the source of my continuing to exist at all. So he is the indwelling Trinity lives in every human person, actually in every living creature. Every living thing out there is held in being by the presence of the Trinity within it, whether it's a flower or a person. God, everything that is because God is holding it. Not just holding it, that's too extrinsic. God is in it, sustaining it with a power that does not come from itself, though God gives it its own individual form. That's what we call the soul of an animal or a plant. Every soul has a form. Flowers have forms, genuses, species. Those are forms given to creative beings by the God who indwells them. That's all of Aquinas in about 35 seconds, okay? But with human people in particular, he not only gives this, what John of the Cross calls natural or substantive union, meaning union by mere fact of existence, but for the human person, God makes available a deeper union that he calls the union of hearts, or the union of loves, or the transfigurative, transformational union. And that's what Athanasius and the others were writing about. God became man so that man could become God. In other words, my intellect and my emotions and my heart, my receptivity, the soul within me can itself become divine. God can become even more intensely present and manifest in me, and his glory can be imparted to me in the measure to which I'm willing to have that pervasion or invasion of his light and love be made possible to me. And Mary, of course, is the archetype here, because she says, basically, it's as if God, who indwells every creature, is knocking on every human heart. Remember, Jesus said, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock." That's an image in this paradigm of the human person opening their door to Christ. So the human person has this further possibility of opening the door of their hearts to Christ, like Mary, who says, so God comes to Mary in the form of an angel and knocks at her door, literally, Nazareth, and says, "Let me in, let me in." Not like Red Riding Hood, but like I guess she thought he was the Red Riding Hood, at the beginning. But he says, God wants to come and dwell in you in a more full way than just the normal way of being with you as your creator. Paraphrase of Luke 1:38 there. And Mary says, she ponders it, and she says, "How can this be? I don't have a husband." And he says, "Well, it's not like that. You're still thinking with the mind of human beings. The Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the one you will conceive will be called Emmanuel." So she says, yes. She says, "Let it be done to me." So then, of course, he is conceived in her. Now, Mary is an archetype or a metaphor or the model for what every human person is being invited to do. And so when we say yes to God, which is contemplative prayer, this is how I discovered that part of I became aware that that's also a crucial part of my shtick in life. I give God permission to indwell me. And so he takes up his home within me. And that's what we call deification, God. And so when I give permission for God to possess me, it's like the opposite of a demonic possession. Instead of giving the evil one permission, you're giving God permission to possess me with his spirit. And he always takes a person up on that. And in that, he reveals to them what obstacles still remain in their lives to complete possession by God. And I suppose only Mary possessed the indwelling Christ to the full extent such that he became, but actually, I think if Mary were sitting here today, I won't say anything for Mary. She's not sitting here today, and I can't speak for Mary. I'll just say the saints have always said Mary conceived of Christ in her heart before she conceived of him in his womb. And they always looked at the true sanctity of Mary as being her openness to God rather than the fact that she was the biological container of the incarnate Christ. Okay, so it was her interiority that was the essence of both her virginity and her motherhood. And the incarnation was a byproduct of her deeper union with God. So she had a biological union with God, but it really was a byproduct of a more primordial union of heart and mind and soul with God, from which Christ became. And we are invited to have that same spiritual nuptial consent and possessiveness with God at the center of our being. And then Christ will be born in us again, not like a child in Mary's womb, but Christ will then manifest himself through the unique individual mission that he has created the person that said yes to him to exhibit. In other words, my being a teacher and my being a preacher is the way that God designed me so that the glory of his indwelling presence would be made known through this instrument that he has gifted with all this preparation and whatever gifts I may possess for articulation, explanation, and connection, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of those are God's doing. Now I'm watching it all happen, but it's not, and it is me at one level, but it's not really me at another level because I'm kind of an observer like anybody else. Okay, having said all that, as I look back on what I do now, can I see echoes of it in what happened before? And I absolutely can. I mean, you know, my whole desire in life before I had discovered my true vocation was to be a professional baseball player. Many of you have heard me say that. I went to the University of Notre Dame with the same idea in mind, to become a professional baseball player, even though the scouts who thought I had some potential said, don't go to Notre Dame, go to Southern California or Arizona State or Florida State, all of which I could have done. And I have a memory now that I'll just share with you. And so I had a lot of scholarship offers out of high school, many to high profile baseball schools. And the people who helped me get those offers said to me, you know, because I had an offer from Notre Dame, they said, if you go to Notre Dame, your baseball career will not flourish like it would if you went to Florida State, for example. But when I went to visit Notre Dame, the moment I walked on the campus, something touched me deeply. And I knew immediately this is where I am meant to go. Again, to pursue a baseball career. I wasn't going there for school. I mean, I could tell you some funny stories about my registration, how I was supposed to be registered in the College of Business Administration because my father told me after you get done playing baseball, you should be able to open a restaurant. You'll need to know a little bit about business after that if you're going to, use your name to make a lot more money. And I said, okay, then I'll study business. But when I got my computer cards for registration, they said the College of Liberal Arts. And there was a little note saying, if for any reason we've made a mistake in putting you in the wrong college, just come back to the administration building by 4 p.m. today and we'll change it for you. So I came out of my dorm. It was my first or second day there. I'm looking around for the administration building. I don't have a clue where that is. And I say to myself, well, I'm going to be a baseball player anyway. What does it matter what college I'm in? I'll just stay here. And of course, I did stay there. My first class was a class in Introduction to Biblical Theology.
Oh, wow.
Let me take one step back. When I said to my father, when I came back from that visit to Notre Dame, I said, Dad, I've decided to decommit to Duke University, which is where I was going to go. And I said, I'm going to go to Notre Dame. And my father told me only much later. In fact, he might have told me on the day I was ordained a priest. He said, I've never said this to you before. He said, but because I was playing a high school baseball game that day when I told my dad I was decided to go to Notre Dame. And he said, I didn't tell you that day because I didn't want to upset your game because we were playing for the city championship, I think, at the time. And he said, but the moment you told me you were going to Notre Dame, I knew you were never going to be a professional baseball player. He says, something told me that. Of course, it's that same father, you know, who after I left the priesthood, he didn't talk to me. And so towards the end of his life, I tried to reconcile with him. And I said, Dad, are you mad at me because I left the priesthood? And he said, well, I don't think you should ever got in it in the first place. And then he said, but then once you did, I didn't think you should have got out. And I said, so basically I can't win. And he says, that's right. But we ended on a good note. And anyway, I could tell you lots of funny stories, but I'll tell you one story then about, so I did go to Notre Dame, and though I wanted to start a little earlier than that. I mean, I can remember, you know, I tell this story whenever I have to preach at a First Holy Communion in a parish anywhere. I remember my own First Holy Communion so much. My parents said, you know, because we had 5 boys, and you know, my sister had died by that time, and we didn't have much money. We never went out to eat. That was a foreign thing to us, though people you know, I heard of other families that went out to eat. I wondered, what does it mean to go out to eat? And I guess you go to a restaurant or something, but that was just unthinkable for us. But my mother said to me, you know, it's your First Holy Communion. We want to give you a gift. You can, within reason, you can have anything you want. And I said, I would like to go out to breakfast. And she said, you would? She said, if you were to go to breakfast, where would you go? And I said, well, you know, when we go down to Parade Street, we always go past the Chuck Wagon. And I said, they've got a sign outside, pancakes with pure maple syrup. I said, can we go to the Chuck Wagon for my First Holy Communion? And she says, yes, we'll go to the Chuck Wagon. So I remember my father actually had, you know, 35mm film of me going up for my first communion. I mean, you talk about looking back on yourself 60 years later. I think there were like 60 second graders going, you know, in those days when the schools were full, we had 3 sections of Catholic kids. I remember looking at myself in this video, you know, and I was trying to I had like the 10 after 6 look, you know, trying to look holy going down. Either that or I didn't want to get the part in my hair messed up by the wind, you know. But I remember going down, my dad was, you know, filming the thing, and I looked up at him and gave him a real mean look, you know, because he was taking a picture. And I do remember, you know, of course I knew everything they told us about what's going to happen in First Holy Communion. And I remember going up, and my mother and I actually even practiced First Holy Communion. I think they gave you, I said, now, Mom, when I receive the host, am I allowed to chew it or what?
Yeah.
And she says, no. Nuns always said, don't chew it. And some of them would even go say, you know, if you did, you're causing Jesus pain and he might start bleeding. And so my mother said, no, she said, it'll just kind of dissolve. And in those days, they probably would, because they were like paper thin little wafers. And of course, you knelt down at the communion rail. And I remember coming up for communion, and I tell this story at the first communion all the time. You know, I knew I was going up for, you know, maybe the most ultimate important moment of my life, because, you know, and I mean, even in second grade, I had that profound understanding that God is coming into my very body. And it was very exciting to me. You know, in those days, you used to get a nice little prayer book. And I mean, I still have that rosary, you know, that leather and the pictures of the mass on the inside. I mean, people who are younger don't know what we're talking about, but it was an ultra sacred moment. Though on the way up, I realized I was battling with myself. I was thinking about how Jesus and I were going to be one here in a second, but I was mostly thinking about the pure maple syrup. And then I was feeling bad that I was thinking about pancakes while I was going for Holy Communion. So I, you know, probably even in the spiritual battle back then, you know, for the right thing. But here's the defining moment. And this is where I look back in this little memoir I'm starting here today. There was a very important moment. So we went to the Chuck Wagon, that was great. And I came home, but I felt, and again, now this is what, 60 years ago, but I felt a need to be alone at that time. because I knew something, it was almost like a little kid being married or something. I mean, I knew it was a very special, there was something in me that said, you need to be alone here. Now, in my house, it was a little bandbox. So there was no alone place to be in my house, except on the stairs going to my father's workshop in the basement, or on the stairs going up to our bedroom. So I got on the stairs because you could close the door, and the other kids are making racket in the kitchen and the living room. Maybe they've been out to play by this time. But I went into the stairwell, and I asked my mom to lock the door because they had a little hook lock on the outside of the door when they wanted to keep us kids upstairs, and they wanted to do whatever they do as adults. And so I'm sitting on the stairway, and I remember very vividly saying some prayer to the effect that, please let me remain as close. Please let me remain as, when I get older, let me remain as close to you as I am today. And that was and the desire to do that. And so you can see that even the desire to be alone was kind of a movement in the direction of contemplative prayer. I wanted to be alone. I wanted to be absolutely quiet. And I wanted to speak to somebody that I knew was present to me. And later even in my grade school career, I had an 8th grade nun who was, of course, in those days, every kid wanted to go into the seminary, every kid but me. I didn't want to go into the seminary. Though I remember when we did visit it in 8th grade, I was kind of impressed by everything, but it wasn't for me by any means. But this 8th grade teacher, she took a real interest in me, and she made me feel really good about myself, because I was a kind of a mediocre basketball player, even though I made the grade school team. But I knew I was a baseball player. Even then I was refining my baseball skills, and I always felt that was my defining identity as a baseball player. But in grade school, they didn't have a baseball team. So I was a big hero in Little League, but there was nothing in grade school. Grade school was football and basketball, and I was too scared to play football and not very talented in basketball, though I loved basketball. So I was really not like the real in crowd in grade school. But this 8th grade teacher, she made me somehow feel special. And we remained friends to her dying day at 90 years old. She died in South Bend, and I saw her a month or so before she passed last summer. That's another story, because well, anyway, that's all these stories go together. But she made me feel very important. And she used to say, you can, to all of us in 8th grade, you can increase your grade by doing extra credit projects. And when I would do an extra credit project, she would always pay me great compliments or encourage me to go above and beyond. Maybe that's where I got the inspiration to be such a voluminous reader or researcher in college, or in graduate school anyway, not college. Anyway, but in 8th grade, I always wanted to do these extra credit projects, but where I wanted to do them, I went to my mother. So we have all these kids making racket in the house, and I didn't have my own room. We had, in our bedroom, we had 2 beds, 3 kids in one, two kids in the other. And I guess by the time I got to 8th grade, and I think it was still 3 and 2 by the time I got to 8th grade. When I got in high school, my dad refinished the attic and put a bed in there for me. So I did have my own room in high school, but not in grade school. So there was nowhere to really study. I could study at the kitchen table, but our house was always chaos. So I said to my mother, because I had this little desk, I would go into the TV room, which was less crowded. The TV was actually in the living room. It was in her bedroom. I said, can I set up a desk in your bedroom? So I went in her bedroom, and she says, yeah, we'll set up a little desk for you here to do your extra credit projects. But I could still hear the racket because the doors were paper thin. So I went into her clothes closet and I separated those. Mom, there's enough room for the desk to sit in. I sit in the clothes closet and so my father set up a little lamp for me in there. I got my little desk. I got the clothes on either side. The door's like at my back. And I'm in there, and I was never happier. Wow. And I said, here I am, loving to be in the clothes closet alone, pursuing the truth. And as I look back on that, I see that God in a real, childlike way was showing me what a contemplative existence would feel like and how good it would feel. So some of that. Back to the priest in college. So Is that the best place to go? What other stops along the way that I want to share with you? Maybe that's the only one. Anyway, this priest was a very young priest. I think he was 33 years old at the time. It was the first class I ever had at the University of Notre Dame. Because I got in the wrong college. So I said religion. I said Bible. I'm thinking to myself, who the heck wants to study the Bible? And I don't know if you remember when the Jerusalem Bible was first printed. It came out in a big hardback copy about that thick, huge. And this priest walks in. There's like 55 of us in this class. And he comes in and he has this Bible, and we're all talking. The bell rings. In those days, I guess they still ring the bell. And he drops this book on the desk. And everybody looks up. And he said, "Gentlemen, I'm Father so-and-so. And by Christmas time, we're going to read every page in that book between now and then." And he said, "Now, I don't know that this will be more difficult. I don't know if this course will be more difficult than all your courses combined, but it'll certainly be more difficult than any other single course you have. So you have 3 days to change classes if you want, and I invite you to consider doing that if this is going to be too much for you." Something to that effect. Though he had a real panache that kind of tweaked and I thought to myself, whenever anybody challenged something like that, even though I was very codependent, I said to myself, I'll show him. Yeah. So next class, there was like half of the students were left. So what he would say was so we would have these huge reading assignments. 50 to 100 pages per class, starting, now but he had selected passage. Really, we didn't read the whole thing. We read all the key, because he was trying to build a narrative. That's what I wanted to remember about him. In any event, a couple things about that priest. So he used to say in class, now he said, I want to know from you what you're learning. So he would call on people. So you had to come prepared. But better yet, he said, it's better that you volunteer to speak than that I call on you. Because if I call on you, it's going to be uncomfortable. And so I'm thinking, so I would kind of hide, and there were enough kids in there. But one day, I think it was something in Exodus, I can't remember, but he says, can anybody tell me what the difference is here between Moses and Abraham? So we've read two narratives now. What's the difference? What's the main difference between Moses and Abraham? There's this in the class. So I think I know the answer to this. And he said, but what he also always said, he says, if you're ever sharing, he says, when I call on you, whether I call on you or you volunteer to talk, first introduce yourself so that I can start putting names to faces. Well, I'm so excited that I've actually got something to say that I think is worthwhile. I forget to introduce myself. So he listens to my comment, which I think was pretty good. And he said, well, then tell us if you like Father Berkwood. And he says, Mr. Zilch, could I see you after class, please? So I went up to see him. Well, now in those days, you'll find this hard to believe, but I used to be a little bit of a comic. And so when I went to Notre Dame, because my goal in life, I had a full baseball scholarship, which they never gave. And my goal in life was to be a professional. And me putting my personal mission in life. So I thought that before I went to Notre Dame, I had little business cards made with my picture and I had a cartoon picture of a baseball player with a glove running down the base path, and the title under it was "Have Glove, Will Travel." Phil Krill of Erie, Pennsylvania.
Wow.
So when I came up to Father Burchell, he said, "Now, are you going to tell me your true name?" And I said, "I'm going to do better than that, Father Berkwood. I'm going to actually give you my business card." So, and he said, So anyway, so he, so he took a special liking to me, I think, just because I gave it back to him, because he was always, he had panache, and he had a way of putting people, of putting them in awkward situations and then kind of rescuing them from them. And, you just, well, a friend of mine who was there at Notre Dame from the same high school, he says, don't you have Burchell for theology? I said, yeah. He said, I hear he's really tough. And I said, well, it seems to be pretty demanding. He says, well, I live in his dormitory. Did you know he has an 11 o'clock mass? And I said, what do you mean an 11 o'clock mass? He says, yeah, he says, right after the library closes, he has a mass. He says, you ought to come to this mass. I said, go to mass during the week? What do you, now in these days, everybody still went to the mass on weekends. In fact, I think at Notre Dame, it might have even still been required. I don't think it was still required, but most people still went. But I didn't realize certain dormitories had either early morning or evening masses. Well, this Father Burchell had an evening mass at 11 p.m. And he says, if nothing else, he says, there's a number of girls from St. Mary's who come. I said, I got to check that mass out. I've got to get over there. So I went to the mass, and my friend called it the Elven mass, Elven, like in elves, like in elves from Lord of the Rings. He said, you're not going to believe this place. I said, now this was, we're talking 1967. The Vatican Council had not even ended by that point. I don't think. I think it ended in 68. In any event, I walk into this chapel and there are no pews. It's beautifully, I mean, stained glass windows are magnificent. The old oak wood around them is gorgeous, all very dark. They had a beautifully light brown tan carpet there. There's a beautiful wooden altar there. Now, I think by that time the altars had turned around facing the people. And then I see this priest who's teaching me theology, and he comes out, and everybody's sitting on the floor, and they all stand up when he comes out, and it's the regular mass, just like we do. And then this guy was truly brilliant. He probably was the smartest person I've ever met in my whole lifetime. I mean, he got a PhD from Cambridge University in England when he was 29 years old. So, knew 6 or 7 languages and published a ton of books, was a scholar. But when he comes to the homily, he reads the gospel for the day. And then he said, so he gives a couple of thoughts. And he said, now, what do you think? And I said, what do you mean? What do we think? So people just start talking. And they'll say something, then he'll ask them, well, that's true. He says, if that were true, what else would have to be true? Well, this conversation goes on for 20 minutes or so until it kind of comes to a natural conclusion. And everybody feels like, holy cow, we've really explored this gospel in some length. And then I've never, I mean, nobody had ever given communion in the hand before. I never heard of that. That wasn't even implemented by that point. And he comes around, just starts handing out communion. And I'm thinking to myself, this is not the right thing to do.
No.
In any case, I was introduced there to a whole different meaning of what it would mean to be at Mass or to be in the liturgy. And then as we went on in that class, and how much time? I still have 10 minutes. What really changed my life about that priest, and it's only amplified since then, he didn't do the thing that I kind of do on the Wednesday gathering. He didn't work his way backwards. But he did say this. He said, the uniqueness of Christ Jesus is that he reveals to the world a God who is less fickle and less subject to ups and downs than all the gods before him, including the God of the Old Testament. And he is bringing into true focus, these are my words now, but this was the gist of what he was saying. Christ brings into focus what the Old Testament could only hope for, which was a God of light in whom there is no darkness, a God of love in whom there is no judgment, but whose very love is a judgment upon those who are lacking in love. And with that, my eyes were opened in a way. And he was the first one that I ever heard in great detail in his book called Philemon's Problem. You know, that book in the Bible called Philemon, or Philemon, as Father Burchell would pronounce it. Philemon's Problem. In that book, Father Burchell critiques the traditional atonement theory. And he said the very defining thing about Christ is what the church has not yet understood and the world has not yet understood. That God does not need to be bought off by anybody but with anything, especially with the violent death of his own son. He comes to reveal to us that God has no need of such sacrifices, and that the true sacrifice is a humble and contrite heart. So that God is pure love. And those who abide in God abide in love, and God abides in them. And I always, and when I heard him say that in that Bible class, he just confirmed something that I knew intuitively. And he could spin that out in a way that made it palpable for people who would listen to him preach and teach. In fact, my friend, my best friend from college who lives in Wheaton, Illinois, he said, I was so enamored of Father Burchell and his revelation of God's love that if Burchell had started a new religion, I would have followed him. And in fact, his followers, who were in the hundreds, called themselves Burchellites. And he took a special interest in me. And one time when I was a senior, because he then became my academic mentor, and he was the one who helped me get into Yale Divinity School after Notre Dame. And he was the one, but there was one time when I was a junior, sophomore or junior, he invited me to come. He said, come on over to the chapel. He says, I'm not gonna have time to say mass tonight because I'm traveling, but I'd like to still say mass today. And I wonder if you'd come and be at the mass with me. And I said, sure. So I showed up at 2 p.m. So we came over there, and, all during the mass, so at the consecration, he says, you hold this and I'll hold the host. I mean, he gave me the ciborium and he held the, so it was like we were celebrating the mass together. And he said, I'll only say this one time. I'll never mention it again as long as I live, but I think you would make a good priest. And he never said another thing about it until I showed up at the seminary many years later. But the person, even before I went to Notre Dame, no, actually after, this is way too much about me. Is this okay to, all by illustration of showing, now that I look back on this stuff, I can see how I was being moved in this direction against my own will, because I wanted to still be a baseball player. So when I came out of Notre Dame, this is a place to pick up the story, and we'll finish it in just a few minutes now. When I came out of Notre Dame, I had a degree in theology, not knowing a whole lot except God is pure love. I know that. And I know the atonement theory is wrong, but what the church is supposed to be, or I didn't know, and I used to ask those questions. Well, Father, what about the sacraments? If God is all love, why do we need the sacraments? And he says, so that people will know what God's love feels like. Simple explanations like that. I thought, wow, how simple could it be? He says, they're not bargaining chips with God. He says, God doesn't need to baptize you to claim you as his own, but baptism convinces you that you belong to him. Stuff like that, he would say. So he was giving me a whole new perspective. In other words, what he was saying is, if you start with the revelation that God is complete love, you'll be able to see how the events in the Old Testament got us to understanding that. If you don't start with that assumption, you'll never get there, because it'll look like a checkerboard history that has no interpretive key to it. Not his words, but mine, but that's what he was saying, okay? So I graduated with a degree from Notre Dame, not knowing anything, really. I mean, I really, the stuff I give you now, I didn't know. The only thing I knew is that God loves you without reserve, and you don't have to fight with him to convince him. That was the soul of my theological background. Okay, and I was a theology major. I taught, graduated with honors and knew nothing. So I'm waiting on July 3rd of 1971. I'm waiting with bated breath by the radio to hear my name called at the Notre Dame Major League Draft.
Oh, my goodness.
And I thought I may not be in the first round, but I'll be in the first couple rounds. Well, 2 days go by and there's no Phil Krill being called. And I looked at my father and I said, "What now?" He says, "Damned if I know." I said, "What am I going to do?" I felt like the guy in the gospel. I'm too old to dig. I don't know how to, I'm not strong enough to dig ditches, and I'm not qualified to do this. I said, "What now?" And then I thought back on my high school. I thought, I still know a lot of people back at my old high school. Maybe they need a religion teacher. So I called up my old high school. I said, "Do you need I said, "I'm just back from Notre Dame. I didn't get drafted." I mean, it was like changing life. It was really, I was gobsmacked by God. Boom. Now I was still actually playing for a semi-professional team at that point. And there were a couple of scouts who said, even though you didn't get drafted, you could still go try out. And I said, "To hell with that. I want to be wanted or I'm not wanted at all." And I dropped baseball. I mean, it was like this whole mirage that I had built up about myself was dissolved in an instant. So I had to find a new life. I had to find an absolute, complete new identity. I had no idea. I didn't see myself as a salesman. I had no mechanical ability. I had no scientific ability. I didn't want to dig ditches. I just wanted to be taken care of, which is what Notre Dame did for me for 4 years. But I realized it did a lot more for me, but the fruits were not yet manifest. So anyway, so my old high school said, "No, we don't need a religion teacher. Can you teach English?" I said, "No, I don't know first thing about English literature. I took those courses at Notre Dame, but I didn't like them and I didn't understand them and I couldn't repeat them. That's what we need. So if you want a job." So then I thought, hey, there's 3 other Catholic high schools in Erie, Pennsylvania. I said, I'll call up one of those. So I called up Mercyhurst High School, which is an elite kind of upper snooty Catholic prep school for all girls. Sister Rebecca Sullivan, principal. I said, "My name's Phil Krill. I just graduated from Notre Dame. I have a degree in theology. I'm looking for a job and I'd love to apply if there's an opening." There's a kind of a silence on the phone. She said, "Well, we did ask a priest to help us out this year with religion." She said, "Could you do it full time?" I said, "Absolutely." She said, "You're hired."
Wow.
So I taught them, and I always say this, and I have to speed up because we're almost done. I taught them everything I knew in the first 2 days. I am not kidding. And I had 36 weeks to look forward to. So I went down, so sister, after the first week, so 2 things happened, and maybe I'll pick up this story next week if you remind me. 2 things happened that first week that changed my life forever. Well, changed my life in the short term, then changed my life. Number 1, I knew at that very moment I was not cut out for high school teaching. So I was never coming back to high school teaching. My question was, how am I going to make it through this year? And I figured out a way to make it through this year. About the 3rd day, Sister Rebecca came up to me in the hallway and she saw me looking a little wilted like a flower. She said, "How's it going? Getting pretty tough?" And she says, you don't look so good." And I said, "Sister, I figured out what the problem is." I said, "I'm not feeling very well." I said, "But I know what the problem." I said, "I have so much to give to these girls and they are just great." I said, they're thirsty to learn, but sister, together we've discovered something, myself and the students, all BS, of course, which is what I'm saying to myself. I'm making this up as I'm going along. I said, "Sister, what has to really," I said, for what I want to do here in the school with a theological vision that I'm trying to roll out here. I didn't really say it quite like that. I would say it like that today. I said, the classroom setting, sister, you should know this after Vatican II. The classroom setting with those desks and all in a line facing forward, I said, this is just not a conducive learning environment. I said, I think what we have to do is we have to remove all the desks, create a learning space where we would have bean bags, kind of shag carpeting. I think we need to have some biblical murals on the wall. Sister, there are some talented artists in this class. We could redo the religion room. And I'm telling you, when you are assessed by Midwestern Evaluation States assessments coming down, they'll think this is the most innovative thing in the country. She said, you sure? I said, without a doubt. She said, well, then go at it. And so that took us up to Thanksgiving. Yeah, it really worked. I got that. We canceled classes until Thanksgiving. And I would teach, I would said, sister, I'm going to bond with the students while we recreate the learning atmosphere. The other thing that happened, and now I've got to quit because it's 11 o'clock, but this, and I should have probably started with this. That very same week, I was coming down having hoodwinked Sister Rebecca, but still totally depressed that I have a whole year of this crap before I can get out and do something different, which was basically go back to school if I could find the money somewhere and find a school that would take me. Because actually, towards the end of Notre Dame, and this is probably why I never became a baseball player, I actually started to enjoy theology more than baseball. And that obviously compromised my, anyway. Though I just saw a video of myself as a senior hitting a home run that Notre Dame ran on their website. So I think I must have done something right in the last year. But in any case, the last day of the last week, Friday afternoon, I'm walking down the hallway and I run into this old woman. I mean, old, you know, I'm 71 now. I think she was 75 or 78 at the time, but she looked quite old. Her picture is on the wall here in our dining room. This woman is about 5'3". She says, she looks at me. There's nobody in the school. It's like after hours. I'm just depressed as can be. And I see this old woman with a handbag. And I said, can I help you? She said, looks at me and she says, why, child? She says, you look like you've been dragged through the hedge backwards. And I said, that's exactly how I feel. I said, who are you? She says, my name is Sister Peter Claver. And I said, you don't sound like you're from around here. She says, I'm from Rome, Georgia. I said, what brings you to Mercyhurst High School? She said, well, I just moved to Erie, Pennsylvania because the Sisters of Mercy who run this school asked me to come here and start a house of prayer. Do you pray? I said, no, sister, I teach religion. She says, why, child, you can't teach religion unless you know how to pray. She said, why don't you come down to my house of prayer sometime? I'll teach you how to pray. And I said, where's your house of prayer? She says, 4th and Sassafras, right on the corner. I says, right across from the Antlers Bar? And she says, you know the place? I said, sister, I'm there every night drowning my sorrows. Are you kidding? She says, come on across. She says, we'll get to know each other. I said, well, it still doesn't explain why you're at the high school. She said, my good friend Dorothy Day is coming into town tomorrow and she's needing a place where she can talk to a bunch of people, but I can't find an auditorium anywhere. I thought these Sisters of Mercy would help me out because I'm starting the house of prayer. I said, you know Dorothy Day? She says, know her? She said, I gave that woman her first $1 so she could start the Catholic Worker. She said, I introduced her to her spiritual director, Father John Hugo. She's probably a Catholic today because of me. But she didn't say that because she wasn't like, she said, but I helped get her started by becoming a Catholic. And I said, she's going to be here tomorrow? Yeah. She said, you like to meet Dorothy Day? I said, yeah, well, not right now, but maybe later. So anyway, Sister Peter and I became very good friends. And so many other stories I wanted to tell you there, but well, one final story from Notre Dame. In my senior year, Father Burchill, of course, had given us this Jerusalem Bible as freshmen. And by that time I had immersed myself in this notion of God's unconditional love. And I remember buying a image copy of the Jerusalem Bible New Testament for $1.95 at the Notre Dame bookstore. And I wanted to reread the Gospel of John because that seemed to me to be the gospel of God's unconditional love. And I remember reading the passage in John 17 and John 15, but the whole Gospel of John. I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I remain in you. I had a felt sense of that you with God. And then John 17, they be one, you and I in you, they in me, us in you. That in each otherness came across to me, and that I still remember sitting on the quad at Notre Dame reading those words from John's gospel and realizing something very important is taking place in me and changing me. I never read the Bible before on my own, but it began to speak to me at a level that I had never, ever experienced before. And that led me to graduate school, and I immersed myself in Protestant theology for 2 years. Anyway, more to that story. But so my point is, when you find the interpretive key for your life, which is your own personal mission statement and personal identity, everything comes to light, and all the fears and guilt and shame dissolve, and you see your previous life as another life, or as a life leading to your present life, and realizing that your present life is what gives meaning to your past life. So perhaps that's what the Buddhists mean by reincarnation. Who knows?
Yes.
Okay, let's finish with the glory be. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.